Let's get into the history now. So, human beings have been consuming caffeine for long before written history, because caffeine is, like I said, it comes from a variety of plants. You can get it in the Caffeine plant in Ethiopia is where the coffee bean originates. But people in that area, they've been consuming caffeine coffee beans for thousands of years, since before recorded history. The aroma warriors of Ethiopia, they used to make kind of like a trail mix type of thing, where they would crush up the coffee berries and mix it with a variety of other things and bring it with them, as they went on hunts and gatherings and just travel and stuff like that. There's a legend that apparently a goat herder in the year 800 noticed that his goats, after eating berries from this tree, were a bit stimulated, and then he tried it and noticed the effects. Now, I mean, maybe that's true, but again, the year 800 is relatively late in human history, honestly. So I don't really buy that particularly. I think it's a good folklore story, but people have been consuming caffeine and coffee beans for longer than the year 800 AD. But again, that's kind of like the accepted lore of where when people realized, oh, this shit gets you high. You know what I'm saying? That's the legend story. So now we get more into just the usage of it into drinks. And so again, the coffee bean originated in Ethiopia, but as a drink itself, that was more in Arab land, in the Middle East, in Yemen specifically. But before that, Arabs made a drink from coffee beans, a little bit different from modern coffee, called kabwa, in 1000 AD, which again was coincided with the golden age of Islam. So it's not just the industrial revolution, age of reason in Europe, but also caffeine greatly stimulated the golden age of Islam, where, that was one of the most glorious ages for the Middle East. And they had coffee houses and stuff like that. And so again, we'll get into that. So 1000 AD is when they used a drink called kabwa. And then the earliest certain appearance of coffee in its modern form comes from the mid-15th century from Sufi monks in Yemen. They used it in monasteries, and that spread then to Mecca, the Middle East, North Africa, and it assisted them in fasting and staying awake at night for prayers and stuff like that, as it's just practical use in the monasteries as modern coffee. That's when we start to see that. And then that's a little bit after that, goes from Yemen and it spreads to the Middle East, North Africa. Then we start to see the first coffee houses pop up in the Middle East. And they were used for the same reasons as European coffee houses, which sprung up in the Industrial Revolution. People would gather to talk about poetry and music. People would gather to talk about science. People would gather to talk about just political and societal ideas, and again, alcohol makes you kind of dumb. We gather and we link together and we drink tequila and we drink whatever, but we party and we kick it. But alcohol doesn't really, prepare you to have intelligent discussion, as we know. Caffeine is a different story. And again, you got to think during a time where society really wasn't structured quite the way that it was. So this really played a strong role in stimulating that progress. Alcohol was banned throughout those regions at the time, which kind of so because of that, and I say that because the coffee houses in the Arab countries were kind of also used for kicking it and partying, whereas the coffee in Europe, they had coffee houses and they had pubs. So there was a bit of a separation in terms of how they would use it. In terms of when European people wanted to get ratchet, they would just go to the pubs. But the coffee houses had a bit more of a prestigious take to them. But because alcohol was illegal in the Islamic fundamentalist nations, they kind of mixed everything together in there, which led to coffee and coffee houses being outlawed in Mecca in 1511, which pushed them underground. Because when things go illegal, people still want them. And people have been introduced to the stimulating beauty of caffeine, so they continue to want it. So now let's talk about how coffee spread into the Christian world. Because at first, again, the coffee beans, they originate in Ethiopia. And then it spread out to the Arab world. Coffee, as it is today, came from Yemen. So then it spread to the Christian world via the spread of the Ottoman Empire. And this is also interesting because whether it be products, food, language, custom, a lot of that has been spread through war and trade. You know, diseases get spread through war and trade. Everything gets spread through war and trade. So not much different. Coffee got spread through war and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, who conquered Yemen in 1536. And then from there, the Syrians introduced coffee to Constantinople in the 1550s, and the Turks loved it. They couldn't get enough. So that is the Ottoman Empire started to spread. You know, the Ottoman Empire wasn't Christian, but as they spread, they introduced it to Christian regions. So the first Europeans, they became aware of coffee. The first Europeans to become aware of coffee were traveling merchants. You know, the people who went out to see the world and sell goods and trade goods. They were the first people, Europeans, to be aware of it, and they would write about it. And that's how people, you know, kind of, those are the first Europeans to see it. Now, in 1565, the Ottomans attempted to conquer the island of Malta, which is like right off the coast of Italy. They attempted to conquer the island of Malta, but they were defeated by the Knights of St. John, who took the Ottoman soldiers as slaves. And then they introduced coffee to the Maltese. So coffee kind of made its way into Europe through the boot of Italy, through the island of Malta. Decades later, the Venetians acquired the drink through trade. So again, war then trade. And they became the first people to fully introduce coffee to the European continent itself. And the Dutch, and this will become important in a second, but the Dutch, they were the Europeans who kind of warmed up to coffee the most in terms of like the quickest enthusiasm for it, along with Italians and other people as well. But they specifically, because you got to think at this time, you know, mid 1500s, 1600s, the Dutch East India Company was doing its thing all over the world. So that played a lot in how coffee spread. Also was through the Dutch East India Company, as well as just colonialism and things like that, which I'll get to in a moment. So the Dutch, they actually located the plant that grew coffee beans in 1660 while they were in the city of Mocha. A traveling merchant found that. And at the time, you know, they were, you know, people in that area, they didn't want outsiders to get hold of the seeds. They didn't want them to be able to germinate the plant because they wanted to, you know, maintain control of, basically be a cartel for the coffee beans, but that didn't last. How could it have lasted? But they found it and they took the plant. And then, but the problem is, you know, because you got to think now the Europeans, they love this some coffee, but you can't really grow coffee in places like the Netherlands or where it's really cold. Europe doesn't particularly have the best climate to grow things like that. You know, you can grow like potatoes and stuff pretty much anywhere. You can grow a lot of stuff in like different areas in like Europe, but coffee in the Netherlands, nah, that don't mix. But like I told you, the Dutch East India Company. So what they did is, you know, they had warmer weather in their sunny colonies of Sri Lanka, which is the south of India. So they started growing coffee in Sri Lanka, the island of Java in Indonesia, and Suriname in South America. The Dutch East India Company superheaded coffee production in these areas in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And they also farmed and cultivated by Haitian slaves in France's colony of Saint-Domingue. So again, like the Dutch, they kind of started pushing it, and the rest of the European powers, they started growing it in their colonies and stuff like that. And this was when it, you know, really started to become more popular within society, but it hadn't yet really fully exploded. Because again, it wasn't that coffee, like, it's not because of coffee that like all of this societal revolution happened. It just played a vibrant role in it. In terms of what helped people push it forward in its spread. And the more coffee spread, the more society changed everywhere that it went. And drugs have that effect. I mean, look at the opium wars. That's a whole nother topic. But China was outlawing opium because their, you know, much of their society in the opium dens was caving, because opium is a motherfucker. You know what I'm saying? That's a whole nother animal. But society changes. Look at how crack impacted, you know, poor Black communities. Look at how meth impacts different communities. You know, so again, these things really do change society, and coffee changed it greatly. So the first European coffee houses opened in Venice, Italy in 1645. Now, this is when, again, stuff really starts to change up, because around this time and a little bit before was the age of reason and stuff like that. But I'll get to that in a minute. And the rest of Europe followed suit, with thousands of coffee shops popping up over the next several decades from 1645 and onward. European coffee houses weren't, I already went over that. So again, I mentioned how the European coffee houses, people would start to gather just to talk about intelligent things, to talk about ideas, because coffee don't do what alcohol do. Speed don't do what alcohol do in general. Why are college students cramming on Adderall? Because it makes you do stuff. Same with any type of speed, it makes you do stuff. So then in 1675, now this is key, because the powers that be, especially in aristocratic societies in the feudal Middle Ages, the powerful started to take note that the plebeians were gathering. And in 1675, Charles II, he actually attempted to shut down coffee houses throughout England. His father actually had been beheaded by dissenting commoners. So, he kind of connected those dots. However, the public outcry was so great that he went on ahead and reversed the ban. So again, by that time, coffee had become like such a strong staple of society that there really was nothing anybody could do. And again, these meetings of people that come together, they talk about these ideas, the same thing that we do on social media, the same thing that we do throughout these outlets now. It was no different then, except back then, obviously, they had no technology and they knew much less. So imagine a society that transitions, and just imagine, a society that transitions from people primarily drinking ale and hard cider all day, all night. And then as society changes from farming and agrarian to industrial, and all the political and societal changes come along with that, because people go from being like drunk all day to stimulated. I need to do something. I'm going to go clean this. I'm going to go do that. Like, that completely changed things. And so after that, we got people of all social classes enjoyed coffee. So it wasn't just like, the common people, but people of all social classes. And everyone saw it as something that helped to bring sobriety to society, which it absolutely helped do, because it literally went from drinking alcohol to drinking caffeine all day. And there's a water base in it. People was unhealthy anyway. I'd pass out if I drank more than a couple cups of coffee, but they was used to that. So, but again, they valued it as something that helped to save them, even if they didn't really fully understand what was happening all the way. So in 1683, the Ottoman army, they attempted to capture the Austrian capital of Vienna, but the Austrian forces defeated them, and they actually found coffee among the Ottoman camps, and they ended up spreading it and taking it there. So again, it's a combination of like war and conquest and trade as it spreads. And then the British colonies in America, they switched to coffee after the Tea Act, after the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party that happened in 1773, because tea became a symbol of royal tyranny. So that helped to drive America's, or early America, the colonies at the time, that helped to kind of culturally, help Americans to give the middle finger to tea, because it represented British control. And so that pushed them into it, which also, tea has caffeine in it too. But again, so like I said, it wasn't just the caffeine, but it was also all the other things happening at the same time. And so now we get into the chemical compounds. So caffeine was first separated from coffee in 1819 by a German chemist. And Brazil to this day, they're the world's leading exporters and producers of coffee. But they became the king of coffee plantations. And after their independence was gained from Portugal in 1822. And obviously slave labor is what drove most of that. And actually, I think I wrote it down. Oh yeah, Brazil, they didn't abolish slavery until 1888, because they were I think they were the last country to like officially abolish it. And coffee profits were largely to blame for that, because Brazil has such a great environment to grow coffee. And then also, like I said, Brazil remains the world's largest coffee producer. But lots of coffee also comes from Vietnam, Colombia, Indonesia, and of course, Ethiopia. And, you know, again, around the time of like the age of enlightenment, which happened, you know, 18th century, which then led to the Industrial Revolution. Around that time, people kind of in Europe, they started kind of thinking more from the heavenly to the natural. So everything's magic, and no, there's an answer for this. And again, the spread of the use of coffee really assisted in that. And their more linear thinking that just made a bit more sense. The separation of powers, the idea coming from Montesquieu in 1748, period led down to the breakdown of absolutism, the age of reason, the age of enlightenment. And it paved the way to capitalism in the modern industrial revolution. In 1670, the newly independent Dutch Republic becomes the world's first explicitly capitalist nation. And again, so all of this coinciding with the spreading and the usage of coffee is really interesting. The more I looked into it, the more I was like, wow, you know, because again, we go to our cabinets, we use salt, and we don't realize at one point this was worth more than gold, because if you don't have salt, you can't live, you know, and so now we can just go to the grocery store. Now we just, you know, coffee is a huge part of our lives, but it changed society. In 1776, Adam publishes The Wealth of Nations, pointing to the power of a well-kept and organized workforce, which requires stimulation. You got all these factories, and again, you got in the Industrial Revolution, that's when you start to see all this factory work. You know what I'm saying? You start to put these, and again, I'm not here. That's a whole nother discussion about the horrors of like the working conditions and stuff. But again, the transition from agrarian to industrial, you got people working these complicated machines. It could be a factory of 100 people. How are you going to stimulate them? You know what I'm saying? So that really played a huge role, because when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, practically everything about modern life was shaped from that in terms of where we are now. Before the Industrial Revolution, 80% of people were involved in farming, and today less than 1% of Americans list their occupations as farming. In fact, from the Industrial Revolution till now, about 200 years or so, society has changed more than it did in the previous 15,000. So rapid change came from that. And a lot of that was directly tied to the usage of caffeine. And also, too, a couple more things before I close out. The coffee break, actually, they're interesting. I learned that that originated, that came from a necktie manufacturing company in Denver. And around the time of World War II, when there was a draft and people came, they lost a lot of their workers to the draft. They tried to replace the workers with older men. That didn't work out so well. They hired women because, as we know, like during that time, women really entered the workforce strongly, and that kind of drove to the idea that, hey, women can do more than just whatever a man tells them to do. But the coffee break actually came from, the idea for that came from women in that factory in Denver. Their bosses, they asked them, you know, how can we help y'all? What do you suggest? And they suggested coffee breaks. So, you know, that became more of a thing, not just doing it, but the break itself. And like I said, the global coffee market in 2021 was valued at $107.93 billion. And by 2027, that number is expected to grow to $167 billion, or $0.51 billion.